Friends, thank you for being here today. I have witnessed the collapse of industrial systems before. The Hanseatic League fell not when their cities were conquered by foreign armies, but when alternative trade routes made their control over Baltic commerce irrelevant to European economic development. The Venetian maritime empire crumbled not from decisive naval defeats, but when Portuguese ships found oceanic routes that bypassed their Mediterranean monopoly entirely. The Dutch commercial dominance ended not through military conquest, but when British manufacturing systems provided alternatives to Dutch trading networks. Each collapse followed the same pattern. The established industrial power assumed their control was permanent because it was based on geographic advantages or technological superiority that seemed impossible to circumvent. They built entire economic systems around choke points they controlled, never considering that dependency relationships could be reversed, or that those who appeared subordinate could become controllers. Now, I observe another form of industrial control that operates through dependency rather than dominance, and it may be the most sophisticated economic weapon ever deployed by a middle power against a global hegemon. The public believes this is a story about automotive manufacturing and trade agreements. They see headlines about factory closures and supply chain disruptions. They read reports about tariffs and border delays. They do not recognize what I recognize: the complete subordination of American industrial capacity to Canadian logistical consent, executed through a production system so integrated that a single Canadian worker can paralyze the entire American automotive sector with a decision to call in sick. This is not industrial cooperation. This is industrial hostage-taking elevated to the level of strategic statecraft. Consider the mathematics of modern automotive production and the cold logistics that determine which nations control manufacturing capacity and which nations remain dependent on others for industrial output. A single Ford F-150 pickup truck, America's best-selling vehicle for over 4 decades, requires components that travel 2,800 kilometers during production, crossing the US-Canada border 7 distinct times before final assembly. This is not accidental routing or inefficient logistics. This is the deliberate result of trade agreements designed to maximize cross-border integration while making independent American production economically impossible. Raw steel begins its journey in Hamilton, Ontario, where Canadian steelmakers produce specialized alloys required for automotive applications. It travels 370 kilometers to Detroit for initial processing into automotive-grade components at American facilities. The processed steel returns 4 kilometers to Windsor, Ontario for precision stamping and forming operations that Canadian manufacturers perform more efficiently than American competitors. The stamped components cross back to Michigan for subassembly operations that integrate Canadian steel with American electronic systems. The partially assembled components return to Canadian facilities in Ontario for painting and surface treatment operations that meet environmental standards more efficiently in Canadian facilities operating under Canadian environmental regulations. The painted components cross again to Ohio for electronics integration and systems installation performed by American technicians working with Canadian manufactured components. Finally, the completed assemblies return to Canadian facilities for final assembly, quality control, and preparation for shipment to American dealerships. Each border crossing represents a choke point where Canadian officials can delay, inspect, or refuse passage for reasons ranging from environmental compliance to labor disputes to diplomatic disagreements with American policy decisions. The mathematical reality is stark and undeniable. Canada possesses 7 opportunities to halt production of America's best-selling vehicle. The United States possesses 0 opportunities to circumvent Canadian control once production has begun. This 7-crossing requirement is not accident or inefficiency. It is the deliberate result of trade agreements designed to maximize cross-border integration while minimizing the possibility of independent American production. The USMCA trade deal requires specific percentages of components to originate from each country, creating production patterns that make geographic separation impossible and alternative sourcing economically unviable. American automotive executives discovered this vulnerability during the February 2025 tariff crisis, when a single labor dispute at the Ambassador Bridge connecting Windsor and Detroit shut down 14 American factories within 48 hours. The dispute began when Canadian customs workers, responding to American tariff threats, implemented work-to-rule protocols that slowed border processing to comply precisely with all inspection requirements, rather than the expedited procedures that had become standard practice. General Motors lost $1.4 billion in that single quarter, with internal company documents revealing that 60% of losses were attributed directly to what executives privately called the Canada factor. Ford's losses exceeded $900 million as production lines throughout the American Midwest ground to a halt. Chrysler Stellantis reported $750 million in disrupted production costs as their integrated supply chains collapsed when Canadian components failed to arrive on schedule. The Ambassador Bridge, a privately owned span barely 2 kilometers long connecting Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan carries 25% of all trade between the United States and Canada and 40% of all automotive components that cross the border. More than 8,000 commercial vehicles cross daily, carrying components that feed production lines throughout the American Midwest and Ontario. When Canadian customs officials implemented the new inspection procedures, average crossing times increased from 15 minutes to 4 hours for commercial vehicles. American factories operating on just-in-time delivery schedules began shutting down within hours of the first delays. Ford's Dearborn facility, which maintains only 2 hours of component inventory to minimize storage costs and maximize production efficiency, sent 12,000 workers home when Canadian manufactured transmissions failed to arrive on schedule. The Rouge complex, Ford's flagship facility, ceased all production operations for 3 consecutive days while management scrambled to locate alternative component supplies that did not exist. Chrysler's Warren plant, dependent on Canadian-produced engines that arrive every 90 minutes during peak production periods, ceased production entirely for 6 days. The facility's 8,500 workers were sent home without pay, as management discovered that decades of integrated production had eliminated all alternative sourcing options for critical engine components. Emergency air freight of components from Canadian suppliers cost Chrysler an additional $45 million while providing only enough parts to maintain minimal production levels. But the most revealing aspect was American automotive leadership's complete inability to respond effectively. Alternative supply sources did not exist because the 7 crossing requirement had created specialized production relationships that could not be quickly replicated elsewhere. Emergency stockpiling was impossible because just-in-time manufacturing had eliminated warehouse capacity to reduce costs. Mexican suppliers could not fill Canadian roles because they lacked the specific equipment and expertise that decades of integrated production had concentrated in Canadian facilities. American automotive companies found themselves negotiating directly with Canadian customs officials, Canadian labor unions, and Canadian government ministers to restore production capacity. These negotiations occurred independently of official diplomatic channels and involved concessions that went far beyond traditional commercial relationships. Ford agreed to increase Canadian employment levels in exchange for expedited border processing. GM committed to expanding Canadian facilities rather than American facilities for future vehicle production. The psychological impact on American automotive leadership was profound. Executives who had built careers on the assumption of American manufacturing independence found themselves managing production systems that depended entirely on Canadian cooperation. Board meetings that had previously focused on American market conditions and American regulatory requirements now included detailed discussions of Canadian politics, Canadian labor relations, and Canadian environmental policies that could affect American production schedules. The transformation revealed how completely the strategic balance had shifted from American control to Canadian leverage. Canadian automotive workers discovered they possessed the ability to affect American economic performance more directly than most formal trade policies or diplomatic initiatives. A strike at a single Canadian facility could shut down multiple American factories. A slowdown by Canadian customs officials could cost American companies millions of dollars daily. Environmental protests that delayed Canadian operations could cascade into American economic losses within hours. This power operated invisibly and without formal acknowledgement, but its effects were measurable and immediate. Canadian automotive employment increased by 23% between 2025 and 2026 as American companies expanded Canadian operations to secure supply chain reliability. Canadian automotive wages rose 31% over the same period as American companies competed for Canadian workers whose productivity directly affected American profitability. The irony was that American efforts to reduce dependence on foreign manufacturing had actually increased vulnerability to foreign control. The tariffs designed to protect American automotive jobs had created incentives for American companies to shift more production to Canada to avoid border complications. The Buy American requirements had encouraged American companies to establish Canadian subsidiaries that qualified as North American suppliers while operating under Canadian jurisdiction. Tesla's experience exemplifies the new reality facing American automotive companies and reveals how completely even the most innovative American manufacturers have become dependent on Canadian industrial cooperation. Despite Elon Musk's public commitment to American manufacturing and his frequent criticism of foreign industrial dependence, Tesla's Model Y production requires Canadian aluminum, Canadian steel, and Canadian battery components that make the vehicle, subject to Canadian production decisions and Canadian labor negotiations. When Canadian steelworkers at ArcelorMittal's Hamilton facility struck in September 2025, Tesla's Fremont factory reduced production by 40% within a week because the specialized high-strength steel required for Model Y structural components could not be sourced from alternative suppliers without months of retooling and recertification. Tesla's Austin Gigafactory, designed to reduce dependence on external suppliers, also reduced production by 25% because Canadian components were integrated into systems manufactured at the Texas facility. Tesla's response revealed how completely American companies had adapted to Canadian industrial control and abandoned any pretense of manufacturing independence. Instead of seeking alternative suppliers or attempting to develop domestic sourcing capabilities, Tesla negotiated directly with Canadian labor unions, bypassing both American and Canadian government officials to resolve the strike. The company offered wage increases averaging 18% and benefit improvements worth an additional $125 million annually to end the strike quickly. Musk personally traveled to Hamilton to meet with union leaders and ArcelorMittal management, acknowledging that Tesla's global expansion plans depended on maintaining Canadian cooperation. The settlement cost Tesla an additional $340 million annually, but company executives characterized these payments as essential production insurance rather than optional labor concessions. Tesla's 10-K SEC filing described Canadian labor relations as a material risk factor that could affect the company's ability to meet production targets and financial projections. The agreement also required Tesla to establish a Canadian battery research facility in partnership with the University of Waterloo and commit to sourcing 60% of its North American battery components from Canadian suppliers by 2028. This commitment tied Tesla's future production capacity to Canadian industrial policy decisions and Canadian environmental regulations that could affect battery manufacturing operations. American automotive companies began structuring their operations around what industry analysts called Canadian consent management. Production schedules incorporated buffer time for potential Canadian delays. Supply contracts included penalty clauses that activated when Canadian disruptions affected American operations. Corporate risk assessment procedures treated Canadian political developments as critical business factors rather than distant international events. The most sophisticated American companies recognized that fighting Canadian industrial leverage was counterproductive and adapted their strategies accordingly. Instead of attempting to reduce Canadian dependence, they maximized Canadian integration to ensure priority treatment during disruptions. Ford committed to establishing its primary North American research and development facility in Ontario, guaranteeing that Canadian workers would be involved in designing the vehicles they would eventually help manufacture. This approach provided Ford with influence over Canadian automotive policy, while acknowledging that American automotive success now depended on Canadian cooperation rather than American independence. The arrangement benefited both countries economically, but it also represented a fundamental shift in industrial power relationships that American policymakers were still struggling to understand and accommodate. General Motors adopted a similar strategy, establishing its electric vehicle battery production center in Windsor, rather than Detroit specifically, to ensure Canadian involvement in GM's transition to electric vehicles. This decision provided GM with access to Canadian electrical expertise and Canadian government incentives, while ensuring that Canadian workers had direct interests in GM's long-term success. The Canadian government recognized this shift and began using automotive leverage to advance broader policy objectives. Environmental regulations affecting automotive production became tools for encouraging cleaner manufacturing practices throughout North American facilities. Labor standards requirements created incentives for American companies to improve working conditions in both Canadian and American facilities. Tax policies favoring automotive investment attracted American companies while generating revenue for Canadian infrastructure development. The transformation extended beyond individual companies to encompass the entire structure of North American automotive production. Industry associations that had previously operated as American-dominated organizations began including Canadian representatives in leadership roles. Technology development partnerships increasingly involved Canadian research institutions and Canadian engineering expertise. Trade policy discussions required Canadian input on issues that had previously been decided unilaterally by American officials. This integration created new forms of industrial diplomacy that operated independently of traditional government-to-government relationships. Canadian automotive executives found themselves negotiating directly with American government officials on issues ranging from trade policy to environmental regulations. American automotive lobbyists began focusing as much attention on Ottawa as on Washington when seeking regulatory changes that would affect North American production. The most significant development was the emergence of what economists called distributed industrial sovereignty. Neither country could independently control North American automotive production, but both countries possessed veto power over the other's automotive. Success. This created a balance of mutual dependency that was more stable than traditional industrial relationships, but also more complex. Unlike traditional industrial relationships, where one country produced raw materials and another manufactured finished products, the seven-crossing model created shared responsibility for every stage of production. Canadian workers controlled steel production and final assembly. American workers controlled electronics integration and sub-assembly operations. Neither group could complete production without cooperation from the other. Canadian automotive unions recognized their enhanced leverage and began coordinating with American labor organizations to maximize worker benefits while maintaining production efficiency. Joint labor negotiations became common as unions realized they shared interests in maintaining the integrated production system that provided both groups with employment security and bargaining power. The success of automotive integration encouraged similar approaches in other manufacturing sectors. Aerospace production began following the seven crossing model as Canadian companies became integrated into American defense and commercial aircraft manufacturing. Electronics assembly adopted cross-border component flows that created similar mutual dependencies. Each sector that adopted integrated production models increased Canadian influence over American economic performance, while providing Canadian workers and communities with increased prosperity and economic security. The cumulative effect was a transformation in the fundamental relationship between the two countries from separate national economies to a single integrated economic system with distributed control mechanisms. American economic planners found themselves managing industrial policies that required Canadian agreement to be effective. Trade negotiations that affected manufacturing required Canadian input to avoid disrupting integrated production systems. Environmental regulations needed coordination with Canadian policies to maintain industrial competitiveness. The most revealing indicator of this transformation was the language used in American corporate earnings calls and SEC filings. Companies began describing Canadian political stability, Canadian labor relations, and Canadian infrastructure investment as critical factors in American economic performance. Investor presentations included detailed analyses of Canadian policy developments that could affect American corporate profitability. By 2026, Canadian automotive production capacity exceeded American automotive production capacity for the first time in history. This reversal reflected not just Canadian investment in automotive infrastructure, but also American companies' recognition that Canadian facilities offered advantages that American facilities could not match. Canadian workers' ability to affect American production created incentives for expanding Canadian operations rather than American operations. The political implications became evident during the 2026 American midterm elections, when candidates in automotive-dependent states found themselves discussing Canadian labor policies, Canadian environmental regulations, and Canadian infrastructure investment as domestic economic issues. Michigan politicians campaigned on platforms that included maintaining good relations with Canadian automotive unions. Ohio candidates promised to support trade policies that would preserve integrated production relationships. This political integration reflected the underlying economic reality that American automotive employment now depended on Canadian decisions, to the same extent that Canadian automotive employment depended on American market demand. The traditional assumption that American workers competed with Canadian workers had been replaced by recognition that American and Canadian workers shared common interests in maintaining the integrated production system that provided both groups with employment opportunities. The transformation was irreversible because it was profitable for all participants and created switching costs that made alternative arrangements economically unviable. American companies that attempted to reduce Canadian dependence discovered that the specialized expertise and integrated logistics systems developed through decades of cooperation could not be quickly replicated elsewhere. The historical precedent for this development is the Hanseatic League's control over Baltic trade during the medieval period. The League created trade relationships that made its members indispensable to the economic prosperity of the entire Baltic region. Canada's automotive leverage operates through similar principles, but with greater sophistication and integration. The seven-crossing production model makes Canadian cooperation essential to American automotive success, while making American market access essential to Canadian prosperity. This mutual dependency creates stability while giving both countries influence over the other's economic performance. The difference is that modern automotive integration operates at a speed and scale that medieval trade relationships could never achieve. Supply chain disruptions now cascade through integrated production systems within hours rather than weeks. The economic consequences of cooperation or non-cooperation are immediate and measurable. Canada has demonstrated that middle powers can achieve strategic influence through industrial integration rather than military power or economic dominance. The seven-crossing automotive model provides Canada with more effective leverage over American economic policy than most traditional diplomatic tools could achieve. This leverage operates continuously and invisibly rather than only during crises. The age of independent national manufacturing may be ending. In its place, we see integrated production systems that create shared interests and mutual dependencies across national boundaries. The invisible veto power that Canadian automotive workers now exercise over American economic performance may be the prototype for international relationships, based on industrial cooperation rather than national competition. Most people do not yet understand what has occurred in the transformation of North American industrial relationships. They see automotive production as a domestic economic issue rather than recognizing it as a sophisticated form of international statecraft. But the Numbers reveal the underlying reality that has fundamentally altered the balance of economic power between the two countries. A single Canadian worker who decides not to come to work can shut down American factories employing thousands of workers. A Canadian customs official who chooses to conduct additional inspections can cost American companies millions of dollars daily. This is how modern economic power operates, not through dramatic confrontations or formal declarations, but through the quiet recognition that others control systems you depend on for your prosperity and success.